Okay, so to get started with this hoop, we are going to begin by putting our palette together. And our palette is the fabric inside the hoop. So I need to look at my fabric and decide, what do I want to stitch? I have like big purple sections here. I've got a lot of like yellow and green. I think I'd like to have a variety. I really like some of this orange. So look closely at your fabric. Take your hoop and just set it on the fabric and kind of move it around and decide like what area emphasizes what I want to see. I really like, as I'm moving it around, I really like this section over here because it gets a lot of the orange. It has this like band of yellow and it's got like a mix of the purple. I've got those white sections that I said I wanted to include earlier. So I think I found the section of fabric I'm going to use, and it just so happens to be on an edge. As you're looking at your fabric, I am not someone who, this is probably not a great habit, but I don't always cut my fabrics on the edge. If the piece that I wanted was right here in the middle of the fabric, I would cut that out in the middle of the fabric. So some people might consider that wasteful. I consider it artsy. That's what I'll call it. So you're going to place your fabric inside the hoop and just make sure before cutting that you really did include, I think I want a little bit more of the orange and these white sections. So that looks about right. Before I cut it, I tighten my hoop and I make sure that the fabric is fairly tight inside the hoop as well. So I just go all around and then tighten it one more time. With fabric scissors then, I'm just going to cut this hoop out of my fabric and I'm gonna leave about 2 inches all the way around. This will get trimmed up later, but for right now, that's about how much fabric I want. So once it's out of the fabric, I can really look at it. This is a lot of excess fabric right now. As I'm stitching, that fabric might get caught on the back and I'd end up stitching through it. So I'm gonna trim a little bit more. What you want is enough fabric around the outside that you can pull to tighten your fabric while stitching your hoop, because no matter how tight your fabric is inside of the hoop, you are always going to need to tighten it as you stitch. It's just par for the course. Okay, so there we go. If you feel comfortable leaving a tiny bit more around the edges, you can. I just like to have enough so that I could fold it back over at the end also. One other thing to keep in mind. So my fabric is in the hoop, and now I'm going to decide which section to bead and what I'm going to use first. So you can refer to the last video where I talk about all the supplies that I'm going to use for this project. And I've linked all of those supplies in my description too through my Amazon storefront. So I am going to begin with these white sections. I really like them. They stood out to me from the beginning, and it's a simple way to get started with beading. So I'm going to be using my John Bead white check seed beads. These tubes open from the bottom, and I'm just going to dump a few out into my beading tray. I'm not going to need that many, but we'll see where we go. I'm also going to be using a thread that doesn't match my beads. I'm just picking a color that I feel like works for this project. You can either choose to match your thread with your beads, or this is a really fun and colorful piece, so I'm just going to switch up the colors. And well, obviously my work is super colorful, so that never scares me or bothers me. Okay. So a very simple way to get started I've tied a knot in my embroidery thread. Whenever I'm working with beads, I always tie a knot to get started. And I just have a needle that will fit through the center of my bead. So I'm going through the center of this hole. I'm going to put a bead on. And then I'm going to secure this one on the sides. I want to see the hole of the bead because I also might come back later and have other beadwork coming through this same hole. So I want it to be flat on the fabric like this. Okay, so my bead is secure. Because it's a larger bead though, and I feel like it's kind of moving around a little bit, I think I'm just going to secure it on the other two sides as well. So I'm coming up on the outside and I'm just going down through the center. Oops, and I just tangled my thread. There we go. If you feel a tangle start happening, try not to pull the thread too tight, because it's a little easier to get it untangled before you've pulled the thread tight. Well, it's still a little loose. And I really did cut a long piece of thread, which I never really recommend because I always tell my students that you're more likely to get knots. So that just proved my point. Okay, so that one bead is down. And when you look at it, you can see it kind of does mimic what you're seeing on the fabric. Whenever I'm embroidering fabric like this, I chose the fabric for a reason because I really liked it. And so I try to keep true to the fabric with my supplies, with my stitches. I'm trying to imitate what I see on the fabric. So again, with this one, I'm going from the outside of the bead to the inside. And until it's secure, your bead is going to just wobble around. That's normal. Now I'm going to keep stitching these larger beads on, but I want to show you how I secure a bead. So say I've finished using my thread or I'm done stitching all of these beads on. On the back of my hoop, I am going to just take my needle under my thread and I go under two of the closest strands. So I just run it under a few of the threads and I'm just going to tie a knot. If I was just using embroidery thread and no beads, I wouldn't tie a knot probably because I wouldn't really worry about the threads coming undone. Because this is going to be heavy with beads, I am going to tie a knot and then I would just cut my thread, leaving a little tail just like that. So I'm going to keep working on these beads in the same way and then I'll show you when mine is finished. Okay, so I have stitched all of these larger beads on. I really like how the white stands out among the colors in the hoop, but because there's not a ton of white, I want to add something more to these beads just so that the white really stands out when I'm finished this hoop. Okay, so I dug through my stash and found two other white seed beads that I'm going to use. These are a size 6 seed bead, and these are a size 8. And just for reference, the other, if I could get this bag open, the other seed bead that I used, the large ones, they're a size 32. So you can see these are the size 32. These are the size 6. And then these are the size 8. Those are great sizes to use in beading. They're my most commonly used sizes, I would say. So I still have my needle threaded with the same color thread, and I am going to start with this bead right here, and I'm going to bring my needle up through the center of that bead, and I'm going to pull my thread all the way through, and then I'm going to stack a size 6 bead. Actually, I'm going to stack 2 size 6 beads, and then I'm going to put a size 8 bead on my needle. Now I'm going to take my needle, so you can see my size, my smallest bead is right here. I'm taking my needle through the 2 larger size beads that I put on my thread, and I'm going to take my needle back down through the beads, just like that. And because I didn't take my needle through that size 8 bead, through that tiny bead right there, that is what is holding my stack of beads together. So you can see from the side, it does stand off of the fabric. So let me show you again. So now I'm just going to go up through this bead, through the center, pull my thread all the way through. I'm going to put 2 of the middle size beads on, take them all the way down, and then the smallest bead I'm going to put on my needle, but I just kind of hold it off to the side so that I remember I'm not taking my needle through that, and I'm just bringing my needle through these 2 middle size beads and pulling all the way through. And then you can just kind of adjust the bead as it goes through. They kind of look like little snowmen, don't they? It's really cute. And then you can pull it tight. Now, if I wanted to add colors, I could do that. I really want the white to kind of stand out on these little pieces, on these sections though. So one more time, I'm going to put 2 of the middle size beads on, push them all the way down to the bead, the largest bead, and now just a small one on my needle, and I hold that one to the side as I take my needle down through those beads and all the way at the end, through the end. Now, the one thing you do want to be aware of before you start something like this is you just want to make sure that your needle is the right size to go through like a small bead and 2 middle-sized beads and a larger bead. So you don't want your needle to be too thick, or else it's not going to go through this tiny bead. So that's why having a variety pack of needles is helpful. So I'm just going to keep doing this to the rest of these white beads, and we'll see how it looks at the end. Okay, so here's what it looks like. Just head on like that. Here's what it looks like. It looks really cool from the side. And you can see we're really getting some instant dimension on this hoop, just with that simple way of combining 3 different sized beads throughout your work. So I think I am going to continue. I might do this same exact technique with a different color throughout this hoop. But right now, that's what I suggest doing. Use this technique, find several colors of beads, or do a monochromatic color palette like I'm doing here, and just add some dimension with a stack of beads.